A giant disguised as a beggar stalks the rainy streets of Istanbul, hunting for the faint glow of a pipe. He finds a smoker and instantly decapitates him. This isn't a bandit. It is Sultan Murad IV. Why did a sensitive poet become a serial killer? The answer will shatter your understanding of tyranny. But first, let's go back to the beginning. Historians call him the Ottoman Nero. But the archives tell a different story. Was this sadism, or was he the only thing standing between the empire and total annihilation? To understand the blood, we must first understand the fear that created him. To understand the monster, you must first weep for the child. Long before Murad IV became the nightmare of the Ottoman Empire, he was its most terrified prisoner, a boy locked in a gilded cage while the world outside burned in a firestorm of anarchy. The year is 1622, and the air inside the Topkapi Palace does not smell of rosewater and incense. It reeks of fear, sweat, and the metallic tang of impending violence. Murad is only 11 years old, a prince of the blood, yet he stands trembling behind the intricate latticework of the harem windows, witnessing a scene that would shatter the sanity of a grown man, let alone a child. Down below, in the courtyards that were supposed to be the sanctuary of God's shadow on earth, a mob is screaming. These are not foreign invaders or angry peasants. They are the Janissaries, the elite, the untouchables, the very soldiers sworn to protect the dynasty with their lives. But the oath has been broken. The soup cauldrons, the sacred symbols of the Janissary Corps, have been overturned in the Hippodrome, a terrifying mute declaration that the contract between the Sultan and his army is void. This is not a protest, it is a hunt. The young Murad watches as the unthinkable unfolds, an event that dismantles the divine order of his universe. His older brother, Sultan Osman II, a reformist who dared to dream of curbing the soldiers' bloated power, is not treated with the reverence due to a caliph. He is dragged from the throne like a common criminal. The imagery is seared into Murad's developing psyche, with the permanence of a brand. He sees his brother, the ruler of 3 continents, stripped of his royal caftans, dressed in rags, and forced onto a knacker's cart. A humiliation so profound it defies the laws of nature. The mob jeers, spitting at the feet of the man they kissed only days before. They haul him to the Yedikul fortress, the castle of the 7 towers, a place of gloom usually reserved for foreign spies and traitors, not the scion of the House of Osman. History records the physical brutality, but we must imagine the psychological devastation for the 11-year-old watching from the shadows. He is witnessing the death of the idea of authority itself. Inside the damp stone walls of the fortress, the horror reaches its crescendo. Osman II is not granted a swift, noble death. He fights for his life. He is young, athletic, and desperate, struggling against his executioners in a brawl that strips away the last vestiges of imperial dignity. The chroniclers tell us that a crushing squeeze to the testicles finally incapacitated the Sultan, allowing the executioner to slip the bowstring around his neck. The greatest power in the Islamic world is extinguished not by a grand decree, but in a dirty, painful scuffle in a dark cell. Murad hears the rumors, the whispers of the harem eunuchs, the stifled cries of his mother, Kusum Sultan. The message is brutally clear. Being Sultan means nothing. The title is a death sentence. The sanctity of the bloodline is a lie. The only truth is the sword, and currently the sword is held by a mob of bearded, opium-addled soldiers who realize they can make and unmake kings at will. Following this regicide, the trauma deepens. the crown is not passed to a strong leader who restores order. It is tossed like a toy to Murad's uncle, Mustafa IV. This establishes a grotesque theater of the absurd that Murad is forced to inhabit. Mustafa is clinically insane, a man who giggles at invisible entities and tosses gold coins into the Bosphorus for the fish to spend. The empire is ostensibly ruled by a madman, but in reality it is held hostage by the Janissary junta and corrupt viziers who plunder the treasury while the frontiers collapse. For the young Murad, life becomes a daily game of Russian roulette. He is moved to the cafes, the cage, a secluded apartment within the palace, designed to keep potential heirs isolated from the world. But for Murad, it is a waiting room for the executioner. Every footstep in the corridor, every creak of the door, sends a jolt of adrenaline through his small frame. Is today the day they come for him? Is today the day the bowstring tightens around his throat? He lives in this state of hypervigilance for years. He watches his mother, the formidable Kosem, navigate this viper's nest with steel and poison, teaching him that trust is a weakness and mercy is a fatal flaw. He sees the hypocrisy of the religious scholars who sanctified his brother's murder and the greed of the pashas who carve up the empire's provinces like butchers. The boy who emerges from this crucible is stripped of innocence. His childhood was not stolen. It was murdered in that cell with Osman. The lessons he absorbs in the cage are not about jurisprudence or theology, but about survival. He learns that the human being is a vicious animal that respects only pain. He realizes that the chaos consuming his city is the result of weakness, the weakness of a sultan who tried to negotiate with tigers. In the silence of his confinement, a resolve hardens within him, cold and heavy as iron. He understands that to survive the beast, he must become a greater beast. The sadism that history will later condemn him for is not born of madness. It is born here in the dark, trembling corners of the cafes, where a terrified boy decides that he will never ever be the one in the cart. He will be the one holding the whip. The fear that suffocates him does not paralyze him. It compresses him, turning his soul into a diamond of pure, ruthless will, waiting for the moment to cut through the glass walls of his prison. To comprehend the sheer scale of the terror that descended upon Istanbul, one must first step into the smoky, dimly lit interior of a 17th century coffeehouse, a place that was far more than a venue for leisure. It was the vibrant, dangerous nervous system of the Ottoman capital. In the winding alleys of Galata and the crowded districts near the Golden Horn, these establishments were the only places where the rigid social hierarchy of the empire dissolved into a haze of tobacco smoke and steam. Here, janissaries sat shoulder to shoulder with dervishes, merchants, and unemployed laborers, fueled by the thick, dark sludge of coffee that had swept the city by storm. But they were not discussing the weather or poetry. In the absence of a free press, the coffeehouse was the internet of the 1600s, an unregulated, chaotic hub of information where rumors traveled faster than a galloping horse. It was here that the shadow government operated. Here that the janissaries, the very men who had murdered Murad's brother, gathered to boast of their crimes, criticize the palace, and plot the next mutiny. To the young sultan, watching with a predator's gaze from the seclusion of Topkapi, the bubbling of the nargile pipes sounded like the hissing of vipers. He understood what his predecessors had missed. the coffee house, was the breeding ground of sedition, a state within a state where the Sultan's authority ended at the threshold. The war he declared, therefore, was not against a beverage or a plant, but against the very concept of private assembly. The catalyst for this brutal crackdown was not theology, but catastrophe. In the late summer of 1633, a spark in the caulking shop of a shipyard ignited a firestorm that would consume 1/5 of Istanbul. For days, the sky turned black, as 20,000 homes were reduced to ash, the flames leaping with such ferocity that they devoured entire neighborhoods and threatened the palace itself. In the aftermath, as the city smoldered and the stench of burnt timber and flesh hung heavy in the air, the whispers began. Whispers that the Janissaries had started the fire to loot the chaos, or that the Sultan's incompetence had drawn God's wrath. Murad, now in his early 20s and seizing the reins of absolute power, flipped the narrative with terrifying precision. He blamed the fire on the carelessness of smokers and the idleness of coffee drinkers, using the disaster as the ultimate pretext to dismantle the networks of his enemies. A firman was issued, draconian in its simplicity. Coffee and tobacco were banned on pain of death. This was not a tax or a regulation. It was a purge. Soldiers were sent to demolish the coffee houses, leveling the structures where the plots against his throne had been hatched. But the destruction of the buildings was merely the opening move. The true horror lay in the enforcement. Murad IV did not rely solely on his guards to police this new order. He became the enforcement himself, birthing the legend of the Tebdil-i Kıyafet, the incognito patrols that would haunt the nightmares of Istanbul for centuries. As night fell, and the curfew turned the sprawling metropolis into a necropolis, the Sultan would slip out of the palace gates, not in imperial robes, but disguised as a rough wandering dervish, a common soldier, or a merchant from the provinces. He was a physical giant of a man, possessed of terrifying strength, often carrying a heavy mace or a sprawling broadsword hidden beneath his cloak. He prowled the labyrinthine backstreets, listening for the telltale murmur of voices behind shuttered windows, or sniffing the air for the forbidden scent of tobacco. These were not inspections, they were hunts. If he caught a man smoking a pipe on a rooftop, or found a group huddled over a secret pot of coffee in a back room, the judgment was immediate and fatal. There were no trials, no judges, and no appeals. The Sultan would reveal himself, a moment of paralyzing horror for the victim who realized the towering stranger before him was the Padishah himself, and the execution would follow instantly. The next morning, citizens would open their doors to find headless corpses left in the gutters, the bloody pipe or coffee cup placed mockingly beside the body, as a grim receipt of their crime. This was psychological warfare of the highest order. By personally patrolling the streets, Murad created a panopticon effect. Because the Sultan could be anyone, anywhere, he was effectively everywhere. The trust between neighbors shattered. A man would not dare light a pipe for fear that the stranger asking for a light was the executioner king. The ban on tobacco, often dismissed by modern observers as a quirky historical footnote or religious zealotry, was, in reality, a masterclass in counterintelligence. Tobacco smoke is visible. It has a smell that lingers and travels. By making the very act of smoking a capital offense, Murad forced the rebels into deeper hiding, stripping them of their ability to signal one another or relax in public spaces. He was suffocating the social lubricant of the Janissary core. The city fell into a terrified silence. The rowdy nights of the Bosphorus replaced by a stillness where the only sound was the wind and the imagined footsteps of the Sultan. He had turned the capital into a grid of isolated households, severing the connections that allowed mobs to form. It was a reign of terror, undeniably, but to Murad, walking through the ashes of the 1633 fire, it was the necessary extinguishing of the sparks before they could burn down his dynasty. The blood flowing in the gutters was, in his mind, the water needed to put out the fire of rebellion. If the night patrols were the creeping shadows of Murad's reign, the events of 1632 were the lightning strike that finally illuminated the true nature of the storm gathering over the Ottoman Empire. To understand the explosion of violence that was about to engulf the capital, one must witness the final humiliation that broke the young Sultan's patience. Just months prior, the Janissaries and Sipahis, whipped into a frenzy by hidden puppet masters, had stormed the palace courts yet again, demanding the head of the Grand Vizier, Hafiz Ahmed Pasha, Murad's loyal friend and father figure. In a scene of heart-wrenching impotence, the 20-year-old Sultan had been forced to watch as his mentor voluntarily stepped into the mob to save his sovereign, only to be hacked to pieces by 17 dagger strokes before Murad's weeping eyes. That day, something in Murad died. The terrified boy who flinched at shadows was buried alongside his friend. In his place rose a cold, calculating avenger who realized that in the Game of Thrones played by the wolves of Istanbul, there is no middle ground between the butcher and the cattle. The time for negotiation was over. The time for the red wedding of the Ottoman court had arrived. The architect of this misery was the new Grand Vizier, Topel Recep Pasha, a man whose physical lameness was matched only by the twisted deformity of his ambition. He was the Sultan's brother-in-law, a Machiavellian schemer who had stoked the fires of rebellion while pretending to hold the water hose, believing he had reduced the Sultan to a terrified puppet. Recep Pasha walked the halls of Topkapi with the arrogance of a man who believed himself untouchable, convinced that Murad was too paralyzed by the trauma of his childhood to strike back. He was wrong. On May 18, 1632, the air in the divan, the imperial council chamber, was heavy with the static of an approaching storm. Murad summoned Recep to the council, not for a debate, but for a reckoning. The Sultan sat on the throne, no longer slumped in fear, but radiating a terrifying, silent intensity that unsettled the scribes and viziers present. When Recep Pasha entered, bowing with the false humility of a traitor, he did not find the trembling youth he expected. He found a predator. The confrontation was swift and shattered the decorum of the court like a hammer striking glass. Murad did not whisper. He roared, his voice echoing off the tiled walls, accusing Recep of treason, of inciting the army, and of spilling the blood of the innocent. "Come, Topel," he's recorded to have shouted, using the derogatory nickname to strip the Grand Vizier of his dignity before stripping him of his life. Before Recep could stammer a defense or signal his allies, the Bostan Bashi, the head of the imperial guards, was upon him. In the Ottoman court, the execution of a high official was usually a private, somber affair. But Murad wanted theater. He wanted the court to smell the fear. Recep Pasha was strangled right there, just outside the gates of the divan, his body going limp as the silk cord tightened, squeezing the life out of the man who thought he owned the empire. But Murad was not finished. He ordered the corpse to be dragged out and thrown onto the dirt before the Baba Humayun, the imperial gate, explicitly so the Janissaries could see that their patron, their secret king, was nothing more than carrion. This was the pivot point of the century. The shock wave of Recep's death paralyzed the rebellion. The soldiers, who had grown fat and lazy on the assumption that the Sultan was weak, suddenly found themselves staring at a head of state who had drawn the sword first. Sensing the shift in the wind, Murad immediately capitalized on the terror. He did not hide in the harem. He marched to the Sinan Pasha kiosk on the waterfront and summoned the leaders of the Janissaries and the Sipahis. It was a gamble of suicidal proportions, walking into the den of the very lions who had murdered his brother. But he did not go as a supplicant. He stood before them, the corpse of the Grand Vizier still fresh in their minds, and demanded an oath of absolute loyalty. He placed a Quran and a sword on the table, the ultimate symbols of spiritual and temporal power. The scene was electric. For the first time in decades, the soldiers looked into the eyes of a sultan and saw death staring back. One by one, the rugged captains and cavalry officers, men who had toppled kings, fell to their knees. They trembled not before an army, but before the sheer force of one man's will. They swore on the holy book to cease their rebellion, to obey his commands, and to deliver the heads of the traitors within their own ranks. This was the Red Wedding, not because of a banquet massacre, but because it was the day the marriage between the army and the anarchy was severed by the blade. Murad had done the impossible. He had stared down the mob and won. As the sun set over the Golden Horn that evening, the chaotic noise of the mutiny was replaced by a disciplined, terrified silence. The boy was gone. The Sultan of Shadows had taken his throne, and the streets of Istanbul, so long slippery with the blood of viziers, were about to be washed clean by a torrent of justice so severe it would be remembered as tyranny. The anarchy was dead, executed alongside Topol Recep, and the absolute reign of Murad IV had begun. If one walks through the hushed marble corridors of the Topkapi Palace Museum today, amidst the dazzling emeralds and silk caftans, there lies an object that stops visitors cold. A mace of such grotesque proportions and terrifying weight that it seems to belong to a mythical giant rather than a human being. This iron beast, weighing nearly 200 pounds, was the personal weapon of Murad IV, and it serves as the brutal anchor for the most bewildering paradox of his reign. History often paints tyrants as cowardly men who hide behind armies, but Murad was a physical anomaly, a warrior sultan carved from granite who possessed a strength that bordered on the supernatural. He was known to practice archery with such obsessive ferocity that his arrows could pierce sheets of metal, and he would spend hours in the palace gardens wrestling with the strongest champions of the Janissary Corps, often pinning them to the grass with a laugh that rumbled like thunder. He was the embodiment of the Ottoman ideal of the Ghazis, a holy warrior whose very body was a weapon of state. Yet to stop at the image of the muscle-bound brute is to miss the tragic complexity of the man. For the same massive hand that could crush a human skull with a single swing of a mace was also capable of the delicate, trembling precision required to hold a reed pen and compose verses of heartbreaking melancholy. This is the enigma of Muradi, the pen name under which the Sultan poured his tortured soul onto paper, revealing a depth of intellect and sensitivity that contradicts every drop of blood he spilled. The duality is jarring, almost schizophrenic. By day, Murad was the Grim Reaper of Istanbul, a man who believed that the only cure for the empire's gangrene was the amputation of its corrupt limbs. He purged the judicial system with the cold logic of a mathematician, firing corrupt judges who sold verdicts for gold and executing pashas who treated the state treasury as their personal piggy bank. He was obsessed with order, balancing the empire's books for the first time in decades, closing the deficits that had drained the economy since his childhood. This was not the work of a madman. It was the work of a rigorous, disciplined administrator who despised the chaotic inefficiency of the previous administrations. But when the sun set and the executions were tallied, the Sultan retreated into the world of the mind. He surrounded himself not just with sycophants, but with wits, poets, and calligraphers. His most famous companion was the legendary traveler and raconteur Evliya Çelebi, whose writings give us a glimpse of a Murad who was witty, curious, and desperate for intellectual stimulation. They would spend long nights discussing geography, history, and music, with the Sultan himself composing melodies for the lute. Compositions that are still played in Turkey today, haunting tunes that speak of longing and sorrow. How does one reconcile the composer with the killer? The answer lies in the concept of perfectionism. Murad IV was a man of absolutes. He despised mediocrity in all its forms. A corrupt judge was an insult to the perfection of the law. A bad poem was an insult to the perfection of language. A rebellious soldier was an insult to the perfection of the state. His cruelty and his artistry were branches of the same tree, a desperate clawing need to impose form upon chaos. In his poetry, he often wrote of the burden of the crown and the fleeting nature of power, using the complex meters of the divan tradition to express the isolation of a man who can trust no one. One famous quatrain speaks of the wheel of fortune that grinds kings to dust, a fatalistic recognition that his power, no matter how absolute, was temporary. This intellectual depth made him even more terrifying to his enemies. He was not a brute you could outsmart. He was a scholar who could debate theology before ordering your execution. He revived the dormant tradition of the Sultan as a patron of the arts, commissioning encyclopedias and histories, trying to drag his empire out of the intellectual stagnation that had set in. The tragedy of Murad the poet is that his sensitivity did not temper his violence. It sharpened it. He understood exactly what he was destroying. When he ordered the death of a corrupt official, he wasn't just removing a political obstacle. He was acting out a moral imperative, a divine wrath against imperfection. The psychological toll of this duality was immense. Imagine the mind that can appreciate the fragile beauty of a tulip in the morning and order the strangulation of 1,000 men by noon. It suggests a compartmentalization of the soul so severe that it likely fueled his descent into substance abuse. The alcohol and opium were perhaps the only things that could silence the poet's conscience so the warrior could do his work. In the end, the artifacts in the top copy tell the whole story. The mace and the manuscript sit under the same roof, relics of a man who tried to bludgeon the world into a shape that would satisfy his poetic soul, leaving behind a legacy that is as impressive as it is blood-curdling. He was a Renaissance prince drowning in a sea of medieval darkness, forcing the world to behave through the sheer force of his terror and his talent. To fully grasp the magnitude of Murad IV's transformation from a palace administrator into a mythic warlord, one must look away from the intrigue of Istanbul and cast their gaze eastward, toward the dusty, sun-scorched plains of Mesopotamia. For 15 years, the Ottoman Empire had lived with a gaping, infected wound in its side: the loss of Baghdad. The legendary city of the caliphs had fallen to the Safavid Persians in 1624, a humiliation that shattered the illusion of Ottoman invincibility and haunted the dreams of every sultan since. But in 1638, Murad decided that the time for mourning was over. He would not send a general to reclaim the jewel of the East. He would go himself. This decision marked the resurrection of the warrior king archetype, a ghost that had not been seen since the glory days of Suleiman the Magnificent. When the imperial standards were raised and the tugs, horsehair plumes symbolizing rank, were planted in the ground at Scutari, it was not just an army that began to move. It was a migration of iron and will. The campaign to retake Baghdad became the ultimate theater for Murad's psychological mastery, a grueling odyssey where he dismantled the barrier between the ruler and the ruled, forging a bond with his soldiers that was tempered in sweat, mud, and blood. As the colossal Ottoman war machine, numbering over 100,000 men, lumbered across the treacherous terrain of Anatolia, the soldiers witnessed a sight that defied all protocol. The Sultan, the shadow of God on earth, was not reclining in a cushioned carriage or hidden behind the silk curtains of a litter. He was riding in the vanguard, clad in chainmail and plate, his face coated in the same dust that choked the lungs of the lowest infantrymen. Murad IV had discarded the trappings of the seraglio to embrace the hardship of the camp. Historical accounts describe a ruler who seemed possessed by a manic energy, riding from regiment to regiment, checking the condition of the cannons, inspecting the supply wagons, and personally disciplining officers who showed signs of incompetence. He slept on a saddle blanket thrown over the hard earth, using his saddle as a pillow, and ate the same stale biscuit and mutton stew as the Janissaries. This was not merely performative humility, it was a calculated, tactical evolution. By sharing the suffering of the march, by shivering in the cold rain of the Zagros Mountains alongside his men, he transmuted their fear into fanatical devotion. The soldiers saw that their sultan was a giant of a man who could draw a bow stronger than any of them and who feared neither the elements nor the enemy. In their eyes, he ceased to be a distant monarch and became a Yoldash, a comrade in arms. When the iron tide of the Ottoman army finally crashed against the walls of Baghdad in November 1638, the siege that ensued was less a battle and more a grinding contest of industrial slaughter. The fortifications were formidable, defended by a determined Safavid garrison that knew surrender meant death. But Murad had brought with him a terrifying array of heavy artillery, the Shahi cannons, that could pulverize stone into powder. The siege lasted for 40 harrowing days, a relentless cacophony of bombardment, mining, and countermining that turned the perimeter of the city into a moonscape of craters and corpses. Murad was everywhere at once, prowling the trenches, directing the fire of the batteries, and exposing himself to enemy musketry with a recklessness that terrified his viziers. It was during this inferno that the Sultan faced his greatest emotional test of the campaign. His Grand Vizier and beloved commander, Tayyar Mehmed Pasha, a man of immense valor, led a desperate assault against a breach in the walls. In the thick of the melee, a musket ball found its mark, and the Grand Vizier fell. When the news reached Murad, the cruel tyrant wept openly, cradling the loss of his Tayyar, which means the flying one, and famously declaring, "Ah, Tayyar, you built a tower of glory, but you destroyed a tower of life." Yet even grief was weaponized. Instead of retreating into mourning, Murad channeled his fury into a final apocalyptic assault. On Christmas Day, 1638, the Ottoman forces surged forward like a tsunami, overwhelmed by the Sultan's demand for vengeance and victory. The defenses crumbled. The Persian commander, Bektash Khan, realizing the inevitability of the end, surrendered the city. The conquest was absolute. Murad IV rode into Baghdad not just as a victor, but as the restorer of Sunni orthodoxy and Ottoman pride, effectively drawing the border between Turkey and Iran that remains largely unchanged to this day with the Treaty of Zuhab. The slaughter that followed the breach was horrific, a grim reminder of the era's brutality, but strategically, it sent a shockwave through the East that solidified Ottoman dominance for another century. As he stood amidst the smoking ruins of the city, covered in the grime of war, Murad IV had achieved the impossible. He had marched across the world, slept in the mud, and torn back the lost prize with his own hands. He was no longer just a sultan, he was the conqueror of Baghdad, the second Alexander, a man who had proven that the decaying empire could still bite with lethal force if guided by a hand of iron. The victory was the zenith of his life, a moment of pure, blinding glory, where the sadism of his rule was eclipsed by the brilliance of his triumph, leaving the world to marvel at the terrifying competence of the last warrior sultan. To witness the final, tragic unraveling of Murad IV, one must look past the glory of the battlefield and step into the suffocating intimacy of the Hasoda, the Sultan's private chambers, where the conqueror of Baghdad waged a losing war against a silent, liquid enemy. It is here, behind heavy velvet curtains and amidst the scent of musk and stale incense, that the most jarring paradox of his reign festers like an open wound. The same iron-fisted ruler who had depopulated the streets of Istanbul to enforce a ban on coffee, tobacco, and alcohol, executing commoners for the mere possession of a pipe or a flask, was himself drowning in a toxic sea of forbidden substances. This was not merely a case of do as I say, not as I do. It was a grotesque theatrical performance of hypocrisy, born of profound psychological damage. By day, Murad was the ascetic warrior, the disciplinarian who purged the empire of vice. By night, he was a man consumed by an insatiable thirst for the very poisons he outlawed. The wine flowed in rivers through the Topkapi Palace, specifically the potent, dark vintages from Tenedos and the searing fire of Rakku, often mixed with varying doses of opium paste to create a numbing cocktail capable of knocking out a horse. This chemical dependence was not a recreational indulgence, it was a desperate form of self-medication for a man whose nervous system had been fried by decades of hypervigilance. The adrenaline that had sustained him during the grueling march to Baghdad and the terrors of the Janissary revolts had now receded, leaving behind a crushing void of silence and paranoia that only intoxication could fill. He surrounded himself not with the pious scholars or efficient generals of his daylight hours, but with a shadowy cabal of enablers, the most infamous being the legendary drunkard, Bekri Mustafa. These drinking bouts were not joyous celebrations, but dark, intense sessions where the Sultan sought to obliterate his own consciousness, fleeing the memories of the brothers he had seen dragged away and the friends he had seen butchered. The tragedy lay in the physical cost of this escape. Murad was a physical giant, a specimen of immense strength, but even the body of a titan cannot process industrial quantities of alcohol and narcotics without consequence. By his late 20s, the hands that could draw a 120-pound bow had begun to tremble with the telltale tremors of advanced alcoholism. His complexion, once bronzed by the Mesopotamian sun, turned sallow and pasty. The eyes that had terrified viziers now frequently glazed over with a milky film of delirium. The chronic stomach pains and gout that plagued him were likely the early warning shots of the cirrhosis that was slowly turning his liver into stone. Yet, the pain only drove him deeper into the bottle, creating a vicious cycle of agony and anesthesia. This physical deterioration had terrifying implications for the state. The strategic cruelty of his early reign, the calculated terror used to restore order, began to mutate into something far more arbitrary and terrifying. In his opium-induced hazes, the line between friend and foe blurred. The omnipresent Sultan, who patrolled the streets to protect the state, began to see treachery in the shadows of his own bedroom. Executions became less about justice and more about the erratic mood swings of an addict in withdrawal. A musician playing a wrong note, a gardener looking at him the wrong way, or a boatman rowing too slowly could trigger a murderous rage that ended in instant decapitation. The court lived on a razor's edge, terrified not of the Sultan's justice, but of his madness. The tragedy of Chapter 6 is the realization that the Ottoman Nero was not a monster born, but a monster made. A man who had conquered the Persians, crushed the rebels, and saved the dynasty, only to be slowly digested by the very demons he had tried to silence. The savior of the empire was rotting from the inside out. His formidable will finally meeting an adversary it could not strangle, behead, or exile. His own broken soul, dissolving one cup at a time in the loneliness of the most powerful throne on earth. If the conquest of Baghdad was the blazing noon of Murad IV's reign, the systematic extermination of his own bloodline was the darkest, coldest midnight of his soul. To understand the horror of what transpired in the secluded pavilions of the Topkapi Palace, one must strip away modern morality and look through the terrifying lens of the Kanun name, the dynastic code of Mehmed the Conqueror, which stated with chilling brevity, "For the welfare of the state, it is permissible for whichever of my sons inherits the throne to kill his brothers." For Murad, this was not just an ancient permission slip. It was a survival manual. He lived in a world where a living brother was not a sibling, but a dormant nuclear weapon, waiting to be detonated by the Janissaries. As long as there was an alternative Ottoman male breathing, the soldiers could riot, depose the Sultan, and install a puppet. Murad, scarred by the memory of his brother Osman's murder and his uncle Mustafa's insanity, was determined to break the cycle of coups by removing the alternatives. The tragedy is that he did not kill his brothers because he hated them. He killed them because he feared them, and even worse, because he may have loved them enough to know they would be used against him. The first blow fell in 1635, amidst the paradoxical backdrop of celebration. The city was rejoicing over the capture of Revan, fireworks illuminating the Bosphorus, but inside the palace, the shadows were lengthening over Prince Bayezid and Prince Suleiman. Bayezid was the specific target of Murad's anxiety. He was a young man of striking potential, handsome, athletic, and intellectually gifted, a mirror image of Murad himself. In any other family, he would have been a beloved partner. In the House of Osman, his competence was his death warrant. During a military competition, Bayezid had thrown a javelin with such skill that it outdistanced the Sultan's own throw. The crowd cheered, but Murad went silent. In that cheer, he heard the sound of treason. He saw a rival who could charm the army. The decision was made with the cold finality of a judge slamming a gavel. While the festivities raged outside, the Bostanbashi, the head gardener, who doubled as the royal executioner, was summoned. The execution of an Ottoman prince was a ritual of suffocating silence. Royal blood was considered sacred and could not be spilled on the ground, so the sword and the axe were forbidden. Instead, the method was the bowstring or a silken cord. One can only imagine the visceral horror of the scene. The brothers being led into a room they had known all their lives, the sudden realization of their fate as the deaf-mute executioners stepped from the shadows, men chosen specifically because they could not hear the pleas for mercy nor speak of the deed afterward. The struggle would have been desperate but brief. Bayezid, the poet and warrior, was strangled while the sounds of his brother's victory celebrations echoed through the palace walls. The sheer psychological weight of this act is crushing. Murad had to give the order, wait for the deed to be done, and then live with the knowledge that he had extinguished his own childhood companions to secure his political present. But the bloodletting did not stop there. The demon of paranoia, once fed, is never satisfied. 3 years later, in 1638, as the army prepared for the Great Baghdad Campaign, the shadow fell upon Prince Qasim. Qasim was the next in line, a vulnerable figure living in the cage, trembling as his brother's shadow grew larger. Murad reasoned that he could not march to Baghdad and leave a potential replacement behind in the capital. It was a terrifying calculation. The safety of the throne required the solitude of the grave. Qasim was executed just before the army departed, his life extinguished as a precautionary measure, a piece of loose ends, tied off with a strangler's knot. This fratricide fundamentally altered Murad. It was the moment the desperate struggle turned inward and devoured his humanity. By killing Bayezid and Qasim, Murad secured his throne, but he destroyed his family and arguably his sanity. He was now alone at the summit of the world, having slaughtered the only people who could truly understand the burden of his existence. The only brother left was Ibrahim, a man so mentally fragile and terrified that Murad considered him incapable of ruling, and thus, paradoxically, safe to keep alive for the moment. The execution of the princes was the ultimate manifestation of the Ottoman tragedy, the idea that the state is more important than the soul. That order is worth any price, even the murder of one's own kin. When Murad rode out to Baghdad, he rode as a man who had burned his bridges, a king without heirs or spares, carrying the heavy silence of his murdered brothers in the hollows of his conscience. The victory in Iraq would be bought not just with the blood of soldiers, but with the ghosts of the princes he left cold in the royal crypts. The final act of Murad IV's life played out not on a battlefield amidst the thunder of cannons, but in the suffocating silence of the Revan kiosk, the very pavilion he had built to celebrate his victories. It was February 1640, and the Alexander of the age was only 27 years old, yet he lay in the imperial bed looking like a man of 80, his massive frame wasted away by the ravages of cirrhosis. The tragedy of his end was visceral. The body that had once wrestled champions and marched through the Zagros snows was now swollen with dropsy, his skin turned the color of old parchment by jaundice, his breath rattling in a chest that could no longer draw air without agony. The conqueror who had strangled the Safavid Empire was now being strangled from within by his own failing organs. But even as the darkness of death crept over his vision, the fire of his obsession, the absolute preservation of the state, burned with a final, terrifying intensity. In his delirium, Murad's mind was not occupied by prayers or repentance, but by a singular, horrifying calculation regarding the future of the House of Osman. He knew who waited in the wings. He knew that just a few hundred yards away, in the gilded prison of the cage, sat his only surviving brother, Ibrahim. And he knew that Ibrahim was not fit to rule a village, let alone an empire. Ibrahim, traumatized by decades of isolation and the constant fear of execution, was mentally unstable, a man who would later be known to history as Ibrahim the Mad. Murad, in his dying lucidity, saw a nightmare vision of the future. The disciplined, feared, and solvent empire he had built with fire and sword, being handed over to a neurotic recluse who would let the corruption return. In a moment that remains one of the most chilling in Ottoman history, the dying Sultan issued his final command to the weeping viziers and his mother, Qasem Sultan: execute Ibrahim. It was an order of dynastic suicide. Murad IV was effectively commanding the extinction of the Ottoman male line. He preferred that the dynasty end with him, strong, victorious, and absolute, rather than rot slowly under the rule of a madman. Some historians suggest he intended the throne to pass to the Crimean Khans, distant cousins, rather than see the dignity of the caliphate mocked by Ibrahim's incompetence. It was the ultimate act of the Sultan of Shadows, a decision born of a ruthlessness so pure it transcended family, legacy, and survival instinct. He wanted to take the future of the empire into the grave with him to save it from disgrace. But for the first time in his life, the Sultan's command fell on deaf ears. The room was paralyzed by the enormity of the request. To kill Ibrahim was to end the lineage of Osman, to plunge the empire into a civil war of succession that would tear Anatolia apart. The statesman, and more importantly, the formidable Qasem Sultan, chose the path of deception. They realized that a dead lion can no longer bite. They lied to the dying man, assuring him that his order would be carried out, or perhaps delaying it with vague promises, until his final breath rattled in his throat. Murad died on February 8, 1640, believing or perhaps fearing that his will had been done. The moment his heart stopped, the spell of terror that had held the empire in a vice grip for nearly 2 decades was broken. The courtiers rushed not to mourn, but to the cage, to drag a terrified Ibrahim out to the throne. The scene was grotesque. Ibrahim, convinced the crowd had come to kill him, as Murad had ordered, barricaded the door and refused to come out until the corpse of his brother was brought to him. Only when he saw the cold, lifeless face of the tyrant who had haunted his nightmares did he believe he was safe. Murad IV left behind a complex and bloody legacy that defies simple categorization. He had inherited a collapsing state, a treasury emptied by thieves, and an army run by gangsters. Through sheer force of will, extreme violence, and administrative genius, he had restored the authority of the Sultanate, replenished the treasury, and secured the eastern borders for a century. He was a savior who saved the state by terrorizing its people. As we look back on the blood-soaked reign of the sadistic poet, the verdict of history is as sharp and double-edged as the sword he wielded. Was he a monster? Undeniably. He executed 25,000 people, killed his own brothers, and ruled through fear. But was he necessary? In the brutal context of the 17th century, the answer is an uncomfortable yes. Without his iron hand, the Ottoman Empire might have fractured and dissolved centuries before its time. Murad IV was the bitter medicine a sick empire needed to survive, a cure that was almost as deadly as the disease itself. He died as he lived, a terrifying force of nature, leaving behind a silence that was not of peace, but of a world holding its breath, grateful that the storm had passed, yet terrified of the void it left behind.